Did we? We were up there for a theater competition.
I think did I leave my needle and thread over there?
Yes, you did, because right here.
Yeah.
Quilts are as much a social outlet as a creative outlet. Historically, women's contributions have been very hidden. Most of the history books document men very well and men's accomplishments, but until recently, women had a support role, and often that wasn't known. And quilting was a way that they did that.
England and Europe had quilting, but the Americans brought it to a whole new level, really developed it, really used it, really made it part of the culture.
The history of quilts is rich and varied, influenced by many different ethnic groups and quilters. The quilt as we know it in America during the colonial days was mainly created and used out of necessity for bed covers and warmth. The earliest American quilts were so connected to everyday life from early day settlers, little records of them exist. Today there is a movement across the country to find some of that lost history while encouraging quilt owners to document what they know about some of their own family heirlooms.
In our family, we do believe in using our quilts, though. And I always tell a story. My grandma was making a quilt that she embroidered, and she's making it for me, and then she died before she got it done. And my mom took it and hand quilted it and brought it to me, and my little girl was about 4 years old, and she wanted the quilt. And I said, no. I said, that's Mom's. And so I took it and folded it up and put it in the closet on the top shelf. When I went to bed that night, I felt like my grandma slapped me side the head and said, there's no sense in pretty quilts and cold babies. So when I got up in the morning, I got that quilt off the shelf and gave it to my daughter, and she slept with that quilt until it just, way after college, and it just literally was falling apart.
People are excited about quilts. It shows the history of their family, and there is something tangible that mom or grandma or sister or somebody back in Europe did, and here it is, and isn't it wonderful? And it is wonderful. There are many treasures.
Mary Reese Fitzgerald, a former schoolteacher, quilter, and now author of the book South Dakota Quilts and Quilt Makers' Infinite Variety, has spent the past several years documenting many of our state's quilts.
It shows my work with documentation of quilts over a 6-year period in South Dakota. The quilt had to reside in South Dakota, although it did not have to be made here, before 1970. And I chose 1970 because that was just before the beginning of the current quilt revival again. We start with what kind was it? We talked about pieced, applique, embroidered, whole cloth, crazy, novelty quilts, and put it in a category. And then I count the number of stitches per inch when it's quilted. I look at what the fiber is that was used to construct the fabric. What kind of condition is it in? Is it blocks, or is it one piece, or how is it arranged? Is it handwork or is it machine work? How is the binding attached? What's the back look like?
So turn it around so they can see that. And it just turned out.
And all of those things together can give me an idea of when the quilt was made.
We just went to Alaska this summer for our vacation, and I came home with a bandana that's a map of Denali National Park. So I set it inside a quilted piece. The map itself is all quilted, and we used the Delectable Mountains pattern to do the mountains, actually, so we have the mountains up above all the green of Alaska.
Beth Mazzella, a Rapid City quilter, former quilt documentarian, and expert in the world of quilting history and tradition, was introduced to the hobby at a young age. Today, she understands that historically, quilting was far more than just a craft. It was, and still is, a social outlet for many women, a way to express themselves.
quilt guilds and the organizations of quilting are a fairly large segment of the quilting community. You would have sizes range from very small groups that meet frequently, family groups, that sort of thing. It's a social gathering that, yes, we get together, we talk. That part of the tradition, the old-fashioned quilting bee, still goes on. Quilts are as much a social outlet as a creative outlet.
About 4 or 5 years after I joined, and then I got ill, and then I didn't join in anything for quite a while. And then I think about 5, 6 years ago, I started coming again, and it just has been wonderful. I made new friends and learned new techniques, and it just kind of keeps your mind off of problems or your health or whatever is bothering you, and so I really enjoy it. I really enjoy encouraging other ladies to get into quilting, and sometimes they will say, "Oh, I want to do that someday," and I get a hold of them and I say, "No, you start right now."
For many families like Karen Olson's, there is little known about some of their family quilts, which helped push her and others to document what details they do know about some of these antique treasures.
When we bought a new bedroom set, when we took the mattress off of the spring, we found this quilt between the mattress and the spring in that bed. Not sure how old it is, but I know it's very old.
The first quilt that I ever made was when I was 15 years old. I was in 4-H. We had old material and garments that were wool, and I took them apart and used a 10-inch cardboard square and cut out these pieces and sewed them together and made a quilt. Well, I got a blue ribbon, and I was very pleased with my ribbon.
I know for sure this was my dad's red jacket, and I know this was a skirt. The rest I am not sure because it was a long time ago.
Most of the history books document men very well and men's accomplishments, but until recently, women had a support role, and often that wasn't known. And quilting was a way that they did that. They could support Civil War quilts, where they sent a quilt with someone going to war. It was not just to keep the guy warm, but to say, I support what you're doing, I'm with you. It's a way to make a statement. There are quilts that document the horror and that people felt with 9/11, and yet supported people as they were trying to recover from that or to remember loved ones lost in it.
This one I made from a kit, and I made it for my husband for Christmas. He's a Vietnam veteran, and we didn't feel like they treated the Vietnam veterans too well. And I think now, since all of the military, we were recognizing them a lot more, and I thought, well, you know, I should make my husband one. And he was so surprised, and I kept it a big secret. And the first thing he said was, "When did you sew this?"
During the Depression years, many of the quilts were made with pastel colors. Some believe it was a quilt maker's way of bringing color into the lives of families struggling during a dark time in American history.
And I think that is counterintuitive. You think, oh, everybody was so depressed. Well, everybody wasn't so depressed, or else they wanted some joy in their life. Pastel was the biggest thing during the Depression years.
This was made for Matilda Roth, which would have been Sandra's great-great-grandmother. And it was made for her 44th birthday in 1887 by her sister. This is embroidered, the label is embroidered, and this one is hand quilted. It was completed when we inherited it.
Today, there are more choices when it comes to designs, fabrics, and even the tools used to quilt. Even though the craft has evolved over the years, the definition of what a quilt is remains the same. It must have 3 pieces, a top, the middle, usually made out of batting, and a back.
A quilt is 3 pieces, top, batting middle, insulating middle, bottom, backing, and that piece of the tradition continues. Because to be a quilt, you have to have those 3 pieces. If you look at the financials, it's growing. It's attracting younger people, but as the young people come in, of course, they want to do things different. They want to change things.
This is a kit that, when it's finished, will make a 64 by 80 quilt. So everything that is in this box is already pre-cut with the pattern, ready for you to open and sew. So you'll find the pattern, and then all of the pieces, and they're already pre-cut and done on the laser, so they're very precise. So really all you need to do is pull them out of the packages and follow the directions. 80 blocks later, you have that quilt. They're a very popular one. They're very time-saving. For people that are busy and don't have time to do all of the cutting, it's really simple. Open it up and just go right to town and start sewing. The other thing that's really popular with these is they're incredibly, incredibly accurate because the laser is so precise. So points come together perfectly. Blocks end up being always all the same. So it can really make you look like an expert quilter when you're really not, or you're just beginning.
This quilt is called the Mohawk Trail, and this was the first one that I made when I started in the late 30s, I'm sure. This was a dress of mine, and my sister Hazel had a smock out of that. The dark ones would have been my mother's because we wore print dresses, and she always wore quite a dark print dress.
I think the passion of it is the recognition of women's contributions, that it was a way that was socially acceptable at whatever point in time for women to say, I care about this, I support what this is, here's how I put my resources into this issue. When you pull a quilt and you see nothing about it except a beautiful piece of fabric, it's like, who made this? Why did they make it? And at least a documentation piece on the back tells you that this is who the woman was and gives you an idea of why she did it, that she believed in this.
I want them to appreciate the beauty of the quilt and the expertise of the person who made it, because that person not only had skill, she had vision, and she wanted to do something that would stay after her and also would show that she was a person who had maybe dreams, had creativity, certainly had abilities as a needleworker, and it gives many of us a chance to say, my mother did this and she was an important person. I have a quilt that I pieced and my mother quilted for me, and when she brought it, she said, I did this for you, and she put the initials of each one of us in the corners and in the sides and dated it with the quilting, and I just really appreciate that.